Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today is an unusual open-ended conversation. My guest is Dr. John Brandenburg, who is a theoretical physicist, a plasma physicist, author of many books, including Death on Mars, Life and Death on Mars. He is also the author of a series of novels called the Morningstar UFO Trilogy, written under the pen name of Victor Norgard. Yes. Welcome, John.
It's a great pleasure and honor to be here, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to be with you, and I know you're a man of many talents, so I thought we'd keep this as a very open-ended interview because it might just go in any direction.
Well, wherever you want it to go.
Let's start with your investigations of Mars. I think that's really fascinating.
Okay, I want to give you a little bit of context. Mm-hmm. I am a plasma physicist. My goal was to help harness fusion energy back in 1975. So I arrived at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, ready and eager to begin my doctoral PhD studies and learn about plasma physics and help in the harnessing of fusion, which I believed we could do in the next 5 years, we could harness fusion. And at the time, the oil embargo had just ended. It was a time of the great price increase in energy of all kinds, so this leading to stagflation. So I felt very much like I was answering my nation's need for new energy sources.
Yeah, I remember people thought we would have fusion reactors before very long.
Yes, we all did. Mm-hmm. And we did make substantial progress. But also, nothing occurs in a vacuum, especially fusion. And there apparently were forces at work that weren't as eager to get fusion energy as the rest of us were, especially myself. But I was at Livermore, and at one end of Livermore, they designed hydrogen bombs. And they also did the designing of the targets for laser fusion. I was doing magnetic fusion, which was more of a slow burn, like a natural gas flame in a magnetic field. Laser fusion was more like a miniature hydrogen bomb explosion and used that kind of physics. So I was there for 6.5 years. I had the pleasure of serving under 3 brilliant scientists as thesis advisors. One unfortunately died of a heart attack when I was working with him, or he died at his son's birthday party on the weekend, unfortunately. But I was just still enthralled with the idea of harnessing fusion energy. So it was a bitter disappointment to me that just after getting my PhD, we had the Reagan-Carter transition, and the energy crisis was kind of ruled as a low priority item, and the Cold War became the front and center as the major effort. So I went from working on making a brighter, warmer future for all of humanity to working on directed energy weapons. And I came to beautiful Albuquerque to work at Sandia National Labs. And I'm trying to give you a context of the mental state I was in. At Livermore, which is near the San Francisco Bay Area, the Cold War was basically an abstraction. It was a beautiful college campus kind of atmosphere. However, when I came to Albuquerque and started working at Kirtland Air Force Base and Sandia Labs, the Cold War was just roiling naked around me. They had a facility where they were testing things to see if they would still be electrically operative after a nuclear war with the EMP. Jet fighters were taking off every morning and flying over our office building. We were working on directed energy weapons. And as I was there, two really important events happened. One was the nuclear winter happened. There had been a dust storm on Mars. And the dust storm on Mars had reached from pole to pole and covered the planet for 6 months. And Carl Sagan and several other scientists had studied this remarkable phenomenon, that you could have this global storm that basically covered the entire planet for 6 months, and concluded that if we had a nuclear war on Earth, the same phenomenon could happen, so a nuclear winter. And this caused a wave of depression to pass through the staff I was working with. We were working at a nuclear weapons lab, Sandia Labs, where we just happened to be working on directed energy weapons, considered a minor detail by the lab management. And my office mate at one point turned to me one day and blurted out that he was going to run home and get his family in case of a nuclear war and head for the hills to try and survive it. But now, because of the nuclear winter, this was like November of 1983, he, instead of trying to head for the hills, because it was assured that more people would die of starvation and cold after the initial nuclear war than would die from the fallout and the blasts. He said he was just going to climb up on the roof of his house and with a 6-pack of beer and watch the whole thing go. And several other people had told me his was the most humorous response to this, but several other people had told me that the whole nuclear winter thing had put them into despair.
Because prior to that, if I remember correctly, people thought we could survive a nuclear war.
Yes, they did. There was sort of a belief that because we were used to the magic fire, it would not harm us. We were too smart to die in a nuclear war. And I myself had decided a long time ago I did not want to survive a nuclear war, so that was just my own way of dealing with it by denial. But then you could tell some kind of crisis occurred in November of 1983, and at my church, where a number of people from Sandia Labs and other defense contractors, we hastily formed a group called Peacemaking, and we were trying to think of how to end the Cold War. What could we possibly do to lessen its... because we could just feel the tension growing. And as it turns out, we found out later, there had been a major NATO exercise called Able Archer. And even though it was absolutely secret, we had come as close to a nuclear war with the Russians as we had during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it was all classified. It was all secret. The Russians had become convinced that we were staging a Trojan horse NATO exercise. And so I was just so alarmed with the idea of nuclear war and the presence of the Cold War around me that when I kind of went on Christmas break, I couldn't really relax. I remember hearing the song, "O Little Town of Bethlehem," and thinking, well, Herod's troops arrived right after, little town of Bethlehem where Jesus was born. And I found myself obsessed with death thoughts. And then on the day after Christmas, I saw coverage of this face on Mars that had been found in a place called Cydonia Mensa on Mars. And it was a PM magazine kind of special, always is interesting, on the day after Christmas. And it showed that they had two very good pictures of this object at two different lighting conditions. And I was just astonished because I had expected when I heard about this that this was going to be a eggplant that looked like Richard Nixon or something like this, something. And my smile had vanished as soon as I saw the thing. And I remember putting my little daughter to bed with a bedtime story. And suddenly I found myself full of hope that perhaps a big discovery like this, that there had been a dead civilization on Mars, would end the Cold War. And the Russians and the United States, we would both go to Mars, not go to war. Instead of going to war, we would go to Mars together and investigate. And I was suddenly full of hope. I could see a mental pathway out of this kind of Mexican standoff we'd become involved in. And so I was determined that when I got back to work that I would track down whoever was doing this research and find out what was going on. When I got back to the lab after the Christmas break, after New Year's, I was quite startled to find out that nobody at work had ever heard of this. And in fact, some people said, Brandenburg, you're making up stories again. And I'd already been acquired a reputation for being a tale-teller and storyteller. And fortunately, one other woman at the office complex where I worked, another woman physicist, she had seen it also and thought it was very interesting. So I tracked down the people who were involved in the research at Goddard Space Flight Center, and I hesitated getting more involved when I heard that they had been investigating this kind of as private individuals. Then I was contacted by a fellow named Dick Hoagland, who was organizing an independent Mars investigation team in Silicon Valley. We had a bunch of scientists, a bunch of engineers, and a bunch of computer companies that were willing to give resources, and we were going to investigate. And I hesitated for several days, thinking, oh dear, this could be a lot of trouble. And it was my first, I had started, the job at Sandia Labs working on directed energy weapons was my first job out of graduate school. And as usual, I had arrived as thinking I was the next Einstein and ruffled some feathers, especially, because the culture was different at Sandia Labs than it had been at Lawrence Livermore, which is more of a university environment, where Sandia Labs was run at the time by Bell Labs, who was very corporate. But as I became more aware of the evidence they had gathered, I suddenly decided, no, I'm going to help this investigation, because I just felt so much danger of nuclear war just by accident. It was as if I was psychically picking up what was going on in the classified world. And I felt that to not investigate something that could change history at such a crucial time in human history, when we could all blow each other up, and all we needed to do was look at the next planet, at the evidence, and have a whole new lease on life of our whole civilization, I thought, I must help this investigation so my daughter can grow up in a world free of the fear of nuclear weapons and nuclear war. So I became involved, and it was very exciting, because we didn't have an internet, but we did have phone terminals, and we could kind of have this telephone conference. And it was all really exciting. The data tapes were obtained, were run by people in Silicon Valley, and verified that, yes, they showed the images that DePietro and Molinar had found. And it was all real. And not only that, there was a 5-sided pyramid 20 kilometers from the face that was clearly seen in the pictures. And I would show these pictures to my colleagues at work, and they were just astonished. And they said, well, it does look like it has civilization on Mars, after all. And I was also aware that this made the management at Sandia Labs a little nervous. But in any case, we pressed on. And I think we helped ease the chance of a nuclear war. We found that all of the work of DePietro and Molinar could be verified. I even ordered pictures from another site on Mars, sight unseen, because it was at a similar latitude, and we found out there was apparently a northern polar ocean on Mars, and the Cydonia Mensa was on the shoreline of that ocean. We looked for another site on the shoreline of the ocean, halfway around the planet, ordered pictures of it, sight unseen, and found two faces at that site in what looked like urban ruins. So this is a place called Utopia, later named Galaxis Chaos. Mm-hmm. I love this name.
As I understand, it's thought that at some ancient time, millions of years ago, Mars had an atmosphere similar to the Earth today.
Yes. It was very simple. The simplest hypothesis was that Mars was Earth-like for most of its history. Apparently, it had an ocean. It had evidence of large amounts of water flowing on its surface. Some of the craters were apparently lakes. It was very kind of bizarre and very science fiction-y. And that not only was Mars like Earth, it had a biosphere with an oxygen atmosphere. That's why Mars is red, because its surface is highly oxidized iron in the red, what's called hematite, making hematite like on Earth. And if you look at pictures of Earth from space, where there's desert, you'll see that the deserts are bright red on Earth. So Earth is the second red planet in this solar system. Of course, we have oceans and clouds. But we finally went to a conference being held in Colorado, the Case for Mars 2, and presented our results. And the Russians had a propaganda magazine called Soviet Life. And they suddenly, a month after we presented our work at Colorado, the Russians published their propaganda sheet talking about the face on Mars. Mm-hmm. So the Russians had seen it. And we had showed both governments, the United States government and the Russian government, the most terrifying sight imaginable. A devastated-looking planet that looked like it was formerly Earth-like, from which stared carved humanoid faces. It was like the end scene in the Planet of the Apes, where the Statue of Liberty is poking out of the sand, and everyone realizes in the audience, this terrible, strange world is actually Earth after a nuclear war. So I felt that we had helped. Mm-hmm. Now, what's fascinating is that this was all kind of attacked and poo-pooed by
the usual response that I heard for a long time is that it was just an accident of light and shadows, and seen from a different angle wouldn't look like a face at all.
That's right. But we had two pictures. In fact, we finally found pictures of it illuminated at morning. You could tell it was symmetrical, even though the pictures were not didn't show as much detail. So we did our job right. And this led, I think, to, in both the Kremlin and the White House, new thoughts, a recognition that there was no safety net for the human race, that if we had a nuclear war, Earth was going to look like Mars with the Sphinx and the pyramids staring up into space. So I think we did it, and now we have actually found out subsequently from sources, especially those involved in remote viewing, that the U.S. government had a highly classified parallel investigation to our investigation, investigating the possibility of a dead civilization on Mars. They were using remote viewing, and it was multidisciplinary. They had other aspects too, and including, precision photo interpretation. So it was very validating to discover that the U.S. government, while publicly poo-pooing the idea that this could be the remains of a dead civilization, was actually conducting a very resource-intensive investigation itself at the same time.
I understand at one time, I remember meeting Richard Hoagland, and he was campaigning to get the U.S. government to send a Mars probe right there to the Cydonia site, but they refused. The astronomers at NASA apparently poo-pooed the idea and said there's so many places of much greater interest.
Oh, it was an extremely interesting time. None of us had any experience, I'd been a creature of the U.S. government lab research system. I was told not to ask questions about things or suppose that the government had any ulterior motives to. But I discovered through this process that the U.S. government could say one thing and do quite the opposite in its own classified settings. And that's exactly what it did. But the effect was the same. There was knowledge that there was the very strong possibility, let's say, that Mars was the location of a dead civilization, and the planet somehow had gone from having an Earth-like climate to being a devastated moon-like place that could hardly sustain any kind of even bacterial life. And that was very important. What also happened then was, by this time I was working in Washington, D.C., and my work, even though I was aware of the physics of nuclear weapons from spending next to 10 years, nearly 10 years at nuclear weapons labs, I had never really studied it or worked on it professionally. And I was looking at the pattern of isotopes of xenon, which is a very heavy gas used in flash bulbs. Someone I'd mentioned, I was standing in line to a Xerox machine, which is what everybody did in those days, and at Sandia Labs. And one of the, I was mentioning to one of the people in the line next to me that Mars had this very unusual pattern of isotopes. It had a very strong peak of xenon-129. On Earth, xenon-129, an isotope, a stable isotope, and xenon-132 are almost exactly equal. But on Mars, there was 2.5 times more xenon-129. This was different from any other planet. It was different from the solar wind. It was different from the moon rocks. It was different even from Jupiter. Everything else matched an Earth-like pattern except Mars in the solar system. And I mentioned this to this fellow, and he said, "Could you let me see that?" And I showed him the book where the data, and his face suddenly lost all of its composure. And he said, "Someone nuked them." And I was stunned at this. At Sandia Labs, by the way, they did have a department at the time that monitored the atmosphere for signs of nuclear activity, nuclear tests. And apparently he was part of that group that monitored the atmosphere. And he basically was telling me there was nuclear weapons signature in the Martian atmosphere. I was quite astonished. I didn't know what to think since I knew very little about the details of that. So I basically confided this with some other members of the investigation, and we did not talk about it simply because I didn't understand it. Neither did anyone else. Later in Washington, D.C., I worked at a place where I worked just down the hall from people who did atmospheric assays for isotopes. After, let's say, North Korea sets off what looks like a nuclear weapon, they would fly airplanes over out in the South China Sea or someplace and pick up traces of isotopes and then figure out if they had actually set off a nuclear weapon. And I showed this to various people who worked with me, who were experts on this, and they agreed, "Oh yes, this looks like nuclear weapon signature." And I finally found in the open literature discussions of this. The difference between xenon from just a nuclear reactor, slow neutrons, and xenon's atoms from a very fast, intense, high-energy neutron event, like a hydrogen bomb explosion. They're quite different. And forensics can be done on this. So when I finally identified this and found sources in the open literature, I informed, by that point we were aware that the U.S. government had an investigation of Mars going. And so we informed them through channels that we had found nuclear weapon signature in the Martian atmosphere, massive nuclear weapon signature. And
I understand we're talking maybe thousands of nuclear bombs.
yeah, so the equivalent of almost all the nuclear weapons on Earth detonated at once on Mars. And so we informed the Pentagon that we had found this. And they sent somebody to receive our data. And we gave him a briefing. And he took careful notes and looked very serious. And then he left. And 6 months later, they sent back word basically saying, why don't you go publish this? Which was quite astonishing to us. In other words, they wanted this to come out. Mm-hmm. They had decided this was not classified. They wanted apparently, the presence of nuclear weapons signature in the Martian atmosphere means there are two independent lines of evidence to suggest intelligent activity on Mars. One was the ruins of what looked like massive archaeology. The other was this nuclear pattern of nuclear weapons residues in the atmosphere. And it looked like someone had targeted what appeared to be a rather primitive civilization on Mars that made massive monuments with nuclear weapons dropped from space, because the hotspots for nuclear activity in thorium and potassium, there were no craters at the hotspots. Apparently, whatever had happened had been an airburst. It had happened in midair. Thousands of, a million megatons going off. A bomb as big as a hydrogen bomb as big as the Empire State Building. Two of them dropped onto Mars at two different sites, and going off apparently 20 miles up in the atmosphere had destroyed Mars. And it completely destroyed the biosphere that had existed there. Someone wanted Mars to be killed and to never be able to rise again. And the problem I had with this was how to tell people this. And I myself began to fall into what I recognized as signs of a clinical depression. Start having nuclear weapons nightmares, which I hadn't had since I was a child. And so not knowing what to do, and I'm just an Episcopalian. I consider myself religious.
I think a lot of young people today don't remember, of course, what it was like when I was a child. We were taught, if there's a nuclear explosion, put your head down under your desk.
Yes.
Things
My
like
father
that.
built a fallout shelter in our home.
Yeah, people were afraid of nuclear war. We grew up with that fear.
Absolutely, we did.
Yeah.
And no place was it more acute than when I was working at Sandia Labs, and this is what stimulated me to join this Mars investigation. And so I decided to write a book. I decided to focus on cosmic good. So I wrote a book called Cosmic Jesus. I'm very fond of the title, and it was about getting I spent in my early 20s. I was a Christian fundamentalist because my parents had joined a Christian fundamentalist. So they'd been Presbyterians, and they joined the fundamentalist church, and I was their loyal firstborn. And so I joined them, and it was all a mad adventure. But I did learn a lot about the Bible, I will say. Imagine just receiving your draft card, and you're a low draft number, and you have to go up for your physical, and you're A1, and then finding out that the world is going to end, and any day now, and the four horsemen of the apocalypse are going to ride. And as I told one person in my church, I said, not only are the four horsemen going to ride soon, they're going to ride right over me because I'm going to be in the army. But anyway, so I found that if you study the Bible in Greek, the word that is translated as world, often in the New Testament, is the word cosmos. So when Jesus says to the people, go out into all the cosmos and preach the gospel to every creature, he means the whole universe, not just Earth. They had a perfectly good word for Earth, G, which is where we get geology. And so I focused myself on something positive, that the human race and Jesus and everything was all belonged in the cosmos, and everything was going to be okay. There, I focused myself on that kind of idea. Then I decided to write my book, Death on Mars. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason was with the rising power of the People's Republic of China, we were once again threatened with a Cold War standoff between two nuclear-armed powers, and I certainly didn't want a repeat of that nonsense. So I decided to write this novel, not a novel, rather a book.
Mm-hmm. It's a nonfiction.
It's nonfiction, you know. Yeah. It's all the frame numbers from all the NASA pictures are there. Anybody who wants to verify these things can verify them. All of the isotopes studies are referenced. It's a scientific book. And I also took the tack, well, suppose it was a natural nuclear reactor. On Earth, we had natural nuclear reactors. In rich uranium deposits, they were invaded by groundwater, and they get a nuclear reactor going. And perhaps that's what happened on Mars. But when I went to conferences and presented that idea, people liked the idea, but some other people said, who said the xenon spectrum is wrong, and besides, there's no craters. If you had a natural nuclear reactor that blew up on Mars, there would be big craters, and there's no craters at the radioactive hotspots. So, apparently, there's a dead humanoid civilization on Mars. It looks as though it was primitive. And then it also appears that someone else came along and dropped two very large hydrogen bombs on Mars, destroying the planet's biosphere and leaving only kind of a moon-like planet with the archaeology preserved on Mars. So this is a sad thing to find. But I've gotten over that and decided, no, it means it's happy news for us, because suddenly we understand that the universe can be a rough place.
And the risk we ourselves face.
Yes. And also, yes, that it's quite possible we'll blow ourselves up. Just like the Martians did not blow themselves up, apparently. Somebody else did that for them. But we have to guard against blowing ourselves up. Why don't we go investigate Mars as a united, like I proposed, the space station consortium, which includes Russia, all going up to Mars together to investigate this. So, I think this is a marvelous opportunity for the United States government to introduce the public to the reality that we are not alone in the universe, but do so in a way that's very non-threatening. Well, the planet's dead because of a nuclear holocaust, but at least the Martians, the people who were living on Mars, they're all dead now. They're not a threat to us.
And I gather these explosions, you could trace them back to some period, maybe 250 million years ago.
Yes. Now, interestingly enough, there was an event on Earth called the Great Permian Extinction that happened about the same time. And the Great Permian Extinction not only wiped out like 95% of the living things on Earth, 90% of the ocean life died. Whereas when the dinosaurs were wiped out, the oceans were pretty much unscathed. The dinosaurs had a bad day, a couple bad years, but in fact they all disappeared after that. and only mammals survived and a few very adaptable reptiles. But during the Great Permian extinction, this planet almost turned into another Mars, and it appears to have happened about the same time. So there's a phenomenon in science called Fermi's Paradox, and first pointed out by the great physicist Enrico Fermi, and that the universe is paradoxical in that since we know that even back in the 50s, they knew that the human race existed, was very noisy and badly behaved. They'd just gone through World War II, and put out a lot of radio noise, and also expanded into all available possible places to live. So he said, where are they? The universe should be a noisy, crowded place because we're a fairly recent species. The age of the universe, even in those days, was known to be at least 10 billion years old. And he said the Earth is 5 billion. So that means there was a whole generation of other planets that could have evolved, had life on them. People had just seen the V2 invented, which was a spaceship. So they knew we could travel outside the atmosphere. And so the idea that other species would have expanded and been fruitful and filled the universe and then been sending out all sorts of radio noise for political advertisements, soap commercials, who knows what. And he said the fact that the universe is very quiet is paradoxical. When the rest of the universe should be full of people like us who are noisy. And so, unfortunately on Mars, we may have found out the reason for Fermi's Paradox. There are forces out there, intelligent forces, which wipe out primitive civilizations. That if you're a truly smart civilization, you're quiet. But of course, we've already ourselves sent out all these radio signals, so there's no way we can call them back. We've announced our presence to the rest of the universe. So, because of Fermi's Paradox, Mars makes sense. The human race is here on Earth. It's very noisy. It's expanded. It's going into space. It's expanding. Yet on Mars, there's apparently a place where they had a humanoid-like race, but it was wiped out by somebody else. And perhaps that is the general pattern of the universe. That's which is noisy gets squelched. And what that means is that we must become spacefaring. We can't call back our radio signals. We must play the game now. We've been invited to this party, and we might as well just march through the door and act like we own the place. Because if we try to hide from the rest of the universe, we'll end up like Mars eventually. And so I'm very glad I wrote the book. I hope it has reduced the possibility of nuclear war, like between China and the United States. And I hope that it encourages the human race to become spacefaring. And on Mars, the U.S. government has the opportunity to introduce the public into the fact that we are not alone in the universe. But the faces depicted on the carvings on Mars look rather human. These people didn't have bug eyes or fangs or antennae. They look pretty much like human beings. So that the human race is a natural thing in the cosmos. We're not alone. And the people we found on Mars are not a threat to us. We are right now not really in a threatened state. And that's very important. Somebody told me once that the U.S. government feels like it's in the situation of being pilot and co-pilot of an airliner, and one of its engines has quit. And it doesn't want to tell the passengers that one of the engines has quit, that we are in possible great danger. Because they don't need to know. It's not going to help the pilot and co-pilot get the plane onto the ground where it can be repaired. So they basically keep quiet about it. Now we can say, oh, one of our engines has quit, but we've got to restart it again. We're fine. And we have to land just to investigate what happened. So I think this could lead to a new space age and to the human race becoming spacefaring, and that this can have a happy ending for the human race. To me, the happy ending for the human race is the future looks like Star Trek.
Well, in your novels, the Morningstar UFO series that you wrote under the pen name Victor Norgard.
Victor Norgard, yes.
You explore the possibility of what it would be like for the human race to enter into a spacefaring condition and interact with other species.
Yes, I do. One of the things that happened to me in Washington, D.C. is I worked with a lot of interesting people, and I worked in places called skiffs, where everything could, classify. You could leave classified papers out on your desk, and
in other words, you had security clearances.
Yeah, we all had security clearances at high level, and one of the interesting things about working in such a place is that you have people there who have security special access to a lot of interesting information. And they occasionally casually talk about it around the coffee machine or in the hall before and after meetings. And so you start realizing, oh, part of the U.S. government is dealing with this reality of us not being alone in the universe already. And so when I left this one place to go teach down in Florida at the Kennedy Space Center, I asked my superior's permission. I said, I've heard some very interesting, wild stories here around the coffee machine. I was wondering if I could write some science fiction and kind of put these things in the science fiction. And they said, and to my surprise, they thought this would be fun. And they said, as long as it's labeled science fiction, John, and why don't you write it under a pen name? And we'll read it, because we always like your reports. And so I wrote a novel called Morningstar Past, The Collapse of the UFO Coverup, where I took the idea that there was a UFO cover-up and that the U.S. government had reacted to this by engaging with one group of aliens called the Greys and signing a secret treaty with them. And that there were other species, including some that were actually very human out there, but that we had tried to enter into this relationship with this one group of aliens to learn more about each other. And unfortunately, in the novel, the history of this is that this did not go well. And so what I tried to explore was the possibility that we were in a kind of secret relationship with a extraterrestrial species, and that things were not going well. And the heroine asks the hero, she says, are things in a snafu state? And he says, we passed out a snafu 10 years ago, and we're far, far beyond FUBAR now. Anyone who is familiar with the military can tell you what those acronyms mean. And so I wanted to look at kind of almost a worst case, but still have it turn out well. And I don't want to do spoilers, but I will say that these two women, of course, they're beautiful. They're news anchors, and they by their courage and determination, they are kind of the Woodward Bernstein of the new millennium. They take leaked documents and other things that they find out, and they managed to bring down the UFO cover-up. They forced the Congress, the House and the Senate to conduct special investigations and have the fact that there is this secret treaty relationship. And you must understand, in the U.S. Constitution, if you're going to negotiate a treaty with another nation, terrestrial or not, it doesn't matter. The U.S. Senate means the U.S. Senate demands advice and consent on this process. They must confirm the ambassadors doing the negotiating. They must ratify the final product. And they must have oversight of the negotiating process. You can't have secret treaties, supposedly according to the U.S. Constitution, and yet in the novel, that's just what they have. So when the UFO cover-up collapses in my novel, there's a constitutional crisis. And what happens in my novel, without trying to spoil anything, is there is an attempted coup d'etat by the secret government who hopes to have, with support of the aliens, they hope the aliens will show up in the skies over Washington, D.C. to back up their tanks, that they will produce shock and awe. Unfortunately, it's very cloudy. No one can see the aliens. And so, just like any great plan, especially one that's evil, all sorts of things go wrong. I mean, in my novel, good is only barely competent.
Well, let me, if I may.
But evil is also suffers from great incompetence also.
Let me step back a little bit, because when we talk about your novel, naturally it's hard to know what percentage of it is derived from stories you heard around the coffee table near the skiff.
Well, I would say a large amount of what I put in there is stuff I overheard. Did I hear it clearly? I don't know. Yeah. I was, let's say I'm connecting dots and trying to make a plot that would logically make sense, given the presently understood laws of physics we have. And so I tried my best to kind of take some of the interesting things I had heard and weave a story about them. Use them as kind of dots on a painting and then paint a whole painting around them. And it was great fun. I found out from doing this that I really enjoy fiction writing.
Yeah, you seem to be a very gifted storyteller.
Well, thank you. I'm part Irish.
But let me step back again, though, with you, John, because I haven't mentioned to our viewers, but you've co-authored several papers with Chris Hardy, who has been interviewed on this channel.
Oh, well, she's a wonderful...
In fact, I'm going to link to one of her interviews right now for viewers who may be interested. I never did interview her, however, on her interest in the Anunnaki. And I believe you actually wrote a foreword to one of her books on that topic.
Yes.
At the time, I felt a little skittish. I didn't know that it would be okay to get into that material back then. But it has to do with the idea that we humans were ultimately genetically engineered by other beings who were identified as gods by the ancient people. And this also plays into your novels.
Oh, well, it does. I all I can say is I sat down to lunch with a few of the people I used to work for in Washington, D.C., and they had actually read my novel and liked it a lot. And they said, John, how did you figure out some of that stuff? And I said, I just guessed. And they said, well, you're a good guesser. What I was doing was just connecting the dots. I'm a rocket scientist. So I...
You may have a touch of clairvoyance.
Well, anyone who writes science fiction is tapping into a kind of clairvoyant vibe, let's say. There's so many places where science fiction has turned out to be prophetic. I don't even need to go into that because it's everyone knows it.
Many examples.
Many examples.
Science fiction novels that
and
describe.
And in a sense, because I wanted to tap into that myself, I decided to write a novel about this. I actually wrote a prequel to the trilogy, the Collapse of the UFO Cover-Up, which has its subtitle, Absolute Secrecy Creates Absolute Power. And I became very aware of the very corrosive effect of absolute secrecy on people and organizations. Maybe these things have changed for the better. I don't know. It's been a long time since I've been in Washington, D.C. But I also wrote a novel called about a big asteroid. And what they euphemistically refer to in the book as an asteroid encounter. In the book, that book is somewhat more lighthearted. It's both. I tend to write kind of dark comedies. Let's say Morningstar Pass is quite dark in parts. The asteroid 20-2012 Sepulveda, which is about the accidental discovery of an asteroid by a Mexican-American astronomer named Alicia Sepulveda. She notices a little streak in a picture of a galaxy she's observing, and discovers it's a new asteroid and names it after her family, of course. And the Air Force takes the numbers that she very carefully worked out for its orbit and put it in their computer and discover, bingo, it will hit the Earth in a year. And it's a large asteroid. It's as big as the one that wiped out the dinosaurs. So this plunges the Earth into a secret crisis because the governments keep the knowledge of the asteroid a secret as long as they can. To prevent the public from panicking. What happens, though, is the governments themselves panic and begin to behave rather irrationally. And but it's, as I said, it's more of a lighter comedy. For one thing, the protagonist, the antagonist is a big rock.
but since you're a scientist
yes.
as well as a novelist, I have to assume that when you put these novels together, you're really playing with possible scenarios.
I am, because I looked at some of the publicly discussed methods for dealing with large asteroids on a collision course with Earth and decided they were inadequate. So in the novel, they have to try like 5 different things. Finally, the first 4 things they try do not work. And they are finally in a nearly panic state themselves, the scientists, because they have to basically make up an experiment and test it on this asteroid as it's on a collision course with Earth. But since it's a prequel, the spoiler is that they do stop the asteroid. They break it up near Earth, so it ends up over L.A., showering L.A. with big chunks of rock, which then have to be taken out by Patriot missiles and laser-guided cannon shells and things like this. And one of the humorous aspects is that the same two women are the same two women are in this novel, and their boss keeps asking them if they want to buy gold, because by that time everybody knows the asteroid is coming and the price of gold is getting higher and higher. And they said, well, since we're here in LA, at ground zero, we're not really interested in what the price of gold is. And they the day after, when the asteroid has been stopped and there's not a pane of window glass left in Los Angeles, but the world and everything else has survived, and they're talking to their boss, and he sounds rather glum, and they said, his name is Manfred, and they call him Manny, and they say, Manny, you sound so sad. The world has been saved. And he says, the price of gold is tanked. I've just lost 200 grand. And things like that actually happen. People bet on disasters, and then the disasters are, taken care of, and people then lose money because they invested in gold or silver or something like this that tanks.
Yeah. Well, John Brandenburg, this has been a fascinating discussion. We've covered a lot of territory. I so appreciate your coming to Albuquerque and
it's been such a pleasure and honor to be here.
You're welcome back. I hope to have more discussions with you in the future.
We can discuss my GEM unified field theory.
Yeah, we haven't even started.
That's right, which believe it or not, Mars was kind of a diversion for me. Mm-hmm. I always felt my great life's work was going to be the unified field theory of Einstein, unifying gravity and electromagnetism. He didn't believe in quantum mechanics, but I do. Mm-hmm. So anyway, we can talk about that some other time.
I look forward to having that conversation in the future.
Great. I so much look forward to it. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being with me, and thank you for being with us.